For more on this, I want to bring in Michael Brest, a breaking news reporter for the Washington Examiner. So, Michael, the big day is finally here. I mean, we've been waiting for this day for a long time. We always knew that it would essentially be the progressive versus the moderate. It was just a matter of what moderate. It looks like now it's Joe Biden. We see the moderates kind of rallying around him as the candidate. How big is today for those two parties, especially acknowledging the fact that there is a possibility of a brokered convention?
Yeah, so today is the biggest day of the primary thus far, with about 1/3 of all delegates being decided today. However, it is important to note that it's just 1/3, with 2/3 being cast later this year.
And I think that's a good point, too, because we're coming off of a South Carolina win for Joe Biden, and a lot of people are asking if it wasn't California that was coming up next, say it was Florida or a different state, the momentum would very much so be behind Joe Biden. So just because the scheduling works out this way doesn't mean necessarily that it's symbolic of the whole race in general. But we are at this point now, and now we see that Sanders is the frontrunner of both the popular vote and delegates. But the Sanders campaign has changed his tune when it comes to those delegates. Of course, this is coming back from 2016. They kind of got the rules that they wanted implemented now. What led to the recent change in his tune?
Absolutely. Well, the change in his tune actually comes from the fact that he is first. And many people expect him to be first after Super Tuesday tomorrow, going into Thursday, depending on when all of the results come in. But so with him in first, it would obviously make sense for him to be pushing for the candidate who gets the most votes to get all the delegates without any arguments. However, that's different than where he was sitting in 2016, where Hillary Clinton was the one who had the majority of the votes, not him.
And it is somewhat of ironic of an argument to make because the Democratic Party is always the one kind of bashing the Electoral College, saying that the popular vote should decide who kind of makes the presidential candidate the winner. And now we have this delegate process where that's not necessarily the case. It's not a popular vote even within the own party. So it's a little bit, I would say, hypocritical in that sense, but they make their own rules. They could do what they want. And it does leave the door open for someone like Senator Elizabeth Warren, Michael Bloomberg, two people who may not necessarily even win a state today, but they're still hoping at the end there is that brokered convention. A lot of those delegates kind of go to them. Is that the strategy that they're looking at right now?
Well, so for Elizabeth Warren, her strategy is looking for a brokered convention and then sort of coming in as an alternative to Bernie Sanders, per se. So in the event Sanders were to be in the lead, establishment Democrats who may be fearful of a Sanders campaign against the president, Elizabeth Warren could provide an alternative in that sense. For Mayor Bloomberg, a lot is really riding on today in regards to how he'll do mainly throughout the South, where he spent hundreds of millions of dollars in advertisements, as well as throughout all 14 states who will be casting ballots today.
Right. And of course, Michael Bloomberg hasn't been on the ballot in the prior primaries or caucuses, so we don't really have a good kind of determination of where he will land today. But he is polling pretty well in a lot of these bigger states because he's been pouring, as you were saying, hundreds of millions of dollars into these races. But if it does get to a brokered convention, we've heard the Sanders supporters say that this whole process is rigged against them. We've heard the moderates say, no, this is the process that was put in play. Does a brokered convention have the possibility of kind of fracturing the Democratic Party going into a general election where they need to have all hands on deck?
From what we've seen thus far, it's very clear that there's an ideological divide between the Democratic Party, and it seems very clear that one of these parties will be hurt in the event that there is a brokered convention, and we could see that whichever part is feeling like the aggrieved party could end up sitting out in November, and that could be a big problem for Democrats.
And we kind of actually already saw this play out a little bit in 2016. I mean, we're talking about a brokered convention and delegates once again, but it also comes back to the idea that a lot of Sanders supporters didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton in 2016. They either voted for President Trump or they didn't show up at all. And a lot of people are kind of hesitant about the idea of not nominating Sanders because they fear that that could happen again. However, Bernie Sanders also has his critics. So if he were to get the nomination, does that possibility still exist? Maybe, for example, the more moderate wing of the party doesn't come out in support of Bernie Sanders?
Absolutely. We're seeing a very real possibility where should Sanders get the nomination, moderates might not turn out, or they might not, or moderate Republicans who aren't sold on the president might lean towards the president because they aren't willing to vote for Sanders, whereas should a moderate get the nomination, we could see the opposite effect, where they may gain some voters who aren't sold on the president in the middle of the country, but they also might not be able to get the same turnout for the 18 to 35 demographic, as well as for people who are just more progressive.
Yeah, I mean, it is that divide that you were talking about earlier in the segment, and it's very much so already at play. We don't necessarily have to wait to a brokered convention, but I guess in a couple hours we'll kind of have a better idea of where we stand. Mike Brest, thank you very much for joining us tonight.